Pack up your things, Fossil. Your era is over. The words landed like a margin call on a leveraged position. Audrey Sinclair didn't even glance in my direction when she said it. She was too busy examining her reflection in the glass wall, adjusting a strand of hair that probably cost more to maintain than my first year's salary. She was 29 years old, Harvard MBA, class of 2019. Installed as our chief investment officer exactly 53 days ago because her father's hedge fund held an 18% stake in our firm. Her blazer was Chanel, her watch was Cartier. Her attitude was the kind you develop when your trust fund has more zeros than your age. The conference room smelled like anxiety and fresh espresso. They'd redecorated it last month on her orders, tore out the mahogany paneling that had witnessed 3 decades of deals, and replaced it with something she called minimalist transparency. Glass everywhere, like working inside an aquarium. I sat there, hands steady on the chrome table, and watched her preen. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't do what most people do when they're being publicly executed by someone who's never survived a market crash. After 29 years in investment banking, you learn that composure is the only currency that doesn't depreciate. You learn to spend it wisely. But let me back up, because that moment, humiliating as it was, didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because Audrey Sinclair had made the most catastrophic miscalculation in the history of Wellington Partners. She thought she was firing a senior banker. She was actually detonating a $2.8 billion bomb. I'm Richard Thornton. I'm the Managing Director of Strategic Advisory at Wellington Partners, which sounds prestigious until you realize it mostly means I'm the person who actually structures the deals, while partners collect fees and take clients to golf tournaments. My job is straightforward on paper. I advise corporations on mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, and restructurings. I'm the reason Wellington went from a regional boutique to one of the most respected advisory firms on the East Coast. For 29 years, I've been the architect behind every landmark transaction this firm has completed. Let me give you the highlight reel. The Pemberton Steel restructuring in 2009. The financial crisis had just hit. Steel demand had collapsed. Pemberton was bleeding $50 million a month, and their banks were circling like vultures. We saved 14,000 jobs and $2.3 billion in enterprise value when every other bank had written them off as dead. I spent 11 months living in Pittsburgh, sleeping in conference rooms, rebuilding their capital structure piece by piece. Their CEO cried when we closed. Actual tears. That's the kind of deal you don't forget. The Atlantic Media merger in 2015. Everyone said it couldn't be done. 2 competitors combining. Overlapping markets, regulatory nightmare, antitrust landmines everywhere. The DOJ had blocked 3 similar deals in the previous 18 months. I found the path through, structured the deal in a way the regulators couldn't touch, and created the 3rd largest media conglomerate in North America. The structure I designed became the template for the next 5 years of media M&A. The Hartwell Pharmaceutical acquisition in 2021. $4.7 billion, cross-border complexity, 3 different regulatory jurisdictions, a target company that didn't want to be sold until I convinced them otherwise. I personally flew to Brussels 16 times to navigate EU competition authorities, spent 6 months learning enough about pharmaceutical regulation to hold my own with their science team. That deal alone generated $89 million in fees for the firm, the largest single transaction in Wellington's history until Meridian. That's what I do. I see structures that other people miss. I build relationships that outlast market cycles. I close deals that shouldn't be closable. The advisory division at Wellington occupies floors 32 through 35 of our tower in the financial district. The carpet is navy blue, worn in paths between the analyst's bullpen and the partner offices. The walls are lined with tombstones from completed deals, acrylic blocks commemorating billions of dollars in transactions. The coffee is always fresh, because bankers don't sleep, we just switch to darker roasts. There's a particular smell to an investment bank at 2 a.m. Cold pizza, stale coffee, the ozone from overworked printers. the desperation of junior analysts who haven't seen daylight in 3 days. I know that smell. I've lived in that smell. For 29 years, that smell has been the background radiation of my professional life. While the partners are upstairs talking about market positioning and strategic growth at client dinners, I'm down here in the trenches, building models until 3 a.m., flying to London for a breakfast meeting and back for a dinner in Chicago, reading financial statements so dense they could be classified as sedatives. I know that smell. I've lived in that smell. For 29 years, that smell has been the background radiation of my professional life. While the partners are upstairs talking about market positioning and strategic growth at client dinners, I'm down here in the trenches, building models until 3 a.m., flying to London for a breakfast meeting and back for a dinner in Chicago, reading financial statements so dense they could be classified as sedatives.
Here's what matters for this story. For the past 2 years, I had been working on the most important transaction in Wellington's history, the acquisition of Meridian Capital by Sovereign Wealth Partners. Let me tell you about this deal, because you need to understand what was at stake. Meridian Capital was the crown jewel of independent asset management, founded in 1987 by a man named Theodore Ashworth, a former Goldman partner who believed that clients deserved advisors who weren't conflicted by proprietary trading desks and investment banking divisions. $127 billion in assets under management, 340 institutional clients, a reputation for integrity that had survived 4 market crashes, 2 financial crises, and countless industry scandals. Theodore Ashworth had built something rare, a financial institution that people actually trusted. Sovereign Wealth Partners wanted to buy it. $2.8 billion, the largest acquisition in Wellington's history, the kind of deal that would cement our reputation for a generation. But Theodore Ashworth wasn't interested in selling to just anyone. He'd rejected offers from BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. He'd turned down private equity firms offering premium valuations. He'd walked away from sovereign wealth funds with unlimited capital. Not because the money wasn't good. The offers had ranged from $2.2 billion to $3.1 billion over the years. He rejected them because he didn't trust what would happen to his clients. Theodore had seen what happened when asset managers got acquired, the promises made during negotiations, the fee structures that were supposed to be preserved, and then, 18 months later, the product rationalization, the cost-cutting, the synergies that meant putting client assets into proprietary products instead of best-in-class investments. Theodore had 340 institutional clients, pension funds responsible for teachers' retirements, endowments funding university research, foundations supporting charitable missions, people who trusted him to put their interests first. He wasn't going to sell to someone who would break that trust. That's where I came in. I'd first met Theodore at a conference in 2018. Not a formal pitch, just a conversation at a hotel bar after a particularly tedious panel on the future of asset management. He'd recognized my name from a deal I'd structured 3 years earlier. I'd advised a small pension fund that was being pressured to move their assets to a larger manager. I'd found them a better solution that preserved their independence and actually improved their returns. "You could have made more money pushing them toward the big firm," he'd said, ordering us both scotch. "Why didn't you?" Because it wasn't the right answer. The right answer doesn't always pay the highest fee, but it's the only answer I can sleep with. He'd studied me for a long moment. "You actually believe that, don't you? In this industry, that's either admirable or naive. Maybe both." "I've been doing this for 23 years, I said. "I've seen what happens when bankers put fees ahead of clients. The deals that blow up, the relationships that die, the reputations that never recover. Playing the long game isn't naive, it's survival." That conversation lasted 5 hours. We talked about his firm, his concerns, his fears about what acquisition would mean for the clients who'd trusted Meridian with their futures. We talked about my approach, my track record, the deals I'd done where I'd walked away from fees because the structure wasn't right. By the end of the night, Theodore had said something that would change the next 6 years of my life. "If I ever sell Meridian," he said, "I'd want you advising the buyer, someone who understands that this isn't just a transaction, it's a trust." Someone who understands became specifically you over the following years. Quarterly dinners in Boston, conversations that had nothing to do with deals and everything to do with building trust. I went to his grandson's bar mitzvah. He came to my daughter's wedding. We weren't just business contacts, we were something closer to friends who happened to work in the same industry. In 2023, Theodore called me with news. "I'm 74 years old, Richard," he said. "My doctors are making noises about slowing down. My wife wants to see the grandchildren grow up. I'm ready to consider a transition, but only to the right buyer, and only with you as my guarantee that my clients will be protected." We spent the next 8 months finding that buyer. Sovereign Wealth Partners wasn't the highest bidder, but they were the right bidder. A sovereign wealth fund from Northern Europe with a 50-year investment horizon, patient capital, no pressure for quarterly returns, a genuine commitment to fiduciary responsibility. Theodore had interviewed their leadership team personally. He'd visited their offices in Copenhagen. He'd spoken with asset managers they'd acquired previously, confirmed that promises had been kept. The deal structure was unlike anything I'd ever built. A 5-year lock on fee structures, a client retention committee with veto power over any investment policy changes, performance guarantees tied to client outcomes, not just asset growth, and the clause that would ultimately matter most, the engagement letter that named me personally as the exclusive advisor. Theodore didn't trust Wellington. He didn't trust any investment bank. But he trusted me. "If you're not running this deal," he said during our final structuring session, "the deal doesn't happen. That's my insurance policy. That's how I know this transaction will be handled with the care it deserves." Our partnership committee had initially balked. This wasn't standard. This created key man risk. What if I had a heart attack? What if I left for a competitor? I convinced them that the alternative was no deal at all. Theodore Ashworth wasn't bluffing. He would walk away from $2.8 billion before he'd compromise on the things that mattered to him. The committee had approved the terms. The engagement letter was signed. We were 8 weeks from closing. 8 weeks from the largest transaction in Wellington's history, the culmination of 6 years of relationship building and 29 years of professional reputation. Then, Audrey Sinclair arrived. Audrey wasn't hired. Audrey was installed like malware on a clean system. Her father, Harrison Sinclair, ran Sinclair Capital Partners, $23 billion hedge fund, the kind of fund that makes its money by taking aggressive positions and pushing for changes at the companies it invests in. Harrison had been accumulating Wellington stock for 2 years, quietly, steadily, building an 18% stake that made him our largest outside shareholder. When Audrey graduated from Harvard Business School with a concentration in disruptive finance, Harrison made some calls. Suddenly, we had a new chief investment officer. Her first week, she eliminated 4 positions, all of them veterans, all of them excellent at their jobs. One was my deputy, a woman named Catherine Park, who'd been with me for 17 years. She could read a balance sheet like a surgeon reads an X-ray. She'd saved us from 3 catastrophic deals by catching fraud that auditors had missed. Audrey called her insufficiently dynamic. The second was our head of compliance, a man named Robert O'Coffer who'd kept us clean through 2 SEC investigations and 1 DOJ inquiry. Audrey said his regulatory paranoia was impeding our growth trajectory. The third was our restructuring specialist, a woman named Linda Vasquez who'd saved more companies from bankruptcy than anyone in the industry. She'd spent 20 years turning around distressed situations. She could walk into a company that was bleeding cash, and within 6 months, she'd have it stabilized. Audrey replaced her with a consultant from McKinsey who billed at $3,200 per hour and had never actually restructured anything, never sat across from creditors at 3 a.m. negotiating haircuts, never looked employees in the eye and told them their jobs were safe when they weren't sure themselves. 3 veterans, combined experience of 53 years, gone in 1 week, replaced by nothing useful. Her second week, Audrey decided to optimize the Meridian transaction. "We're leaving money on the table," she announced at a meeting I wasn't invited to. "The fee structure is too conservative. We need to accelerate closing and increase our success fee by 40%. The market won't wait for handholding."
Let me tell you why that approach was catastrophic. A $2.8 billion acquisition isn't a trade you execute, it's a symphony you conduct.
regulatory approvals from 3 different jurisdictions, client consent protocols for 340 institutional relationships, investment policy reviews that couldn't be rushed without triggering fiduciary concerns. Our timeline was 8 weeks because that was the minimum required to do this properly. 8 weeks to complete due diligence that would normally take 6 months. 8 weeks to secure regulatory clearances that could take years. 8 weeks to communicate with clients whose trust was the entire value of the acquisition. I'd compressed everything possible, called in favors from regulators I'd worked with for decades, worked my team around the clock. The 8-week timeline was already aggressive. It was already the kind of schedule that made experienced bankers nervous. Accelerating further wasn't aggressive, it was malpractice. But Audrey didn't understand that. Audrey had never closed a deal. Audrey had only read about deals in case studies, where the complexity was reduced to bullet points and the human relationships were invisible. She didn't know that regulatory approvals can't be rushed because shortcuts create legal exposure. She didn't know that client communications have mandatory notice periods that protect fiduciary relationships. She didn't know that Theodore Ashworth had specifically required the 8-week timeline because he needed time to personally call every major client. She knew none of this because she'd never bothered to ask. And now she was making decisions that would affect billions of dollars and thousands of lives without understanding any of the constraints. Her 3rd week, she called Theodore Ashworth directly, without telling me, without consulting anyone. I found out because Theodore called me that night, his voice carrying something I'd never heard before. Disappointment. Not anger. Disappointment, which was somehow worse. "Richard," he said, "who is this woman? She called me today and told me we needed to accelerate the transaction timeline because your partnership was concerned about fee optimization. She said she was your new supervisor and that I should direct all communications through her going forward." My stomach dropped. 6 years of relationship building threatened by a single phone call. She also suggested that if we didn't agree to an accelerated timeline with enhanced fee terms, Wellington might need to reconsider our commitment to the engagement. She used those exact words, reconsider our commitment, like she was threatening to walk away if I didn't let her squeeze more money out of a deal that's supposed to protect my clients. "Theodore," I said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know she was going to call. This isn't how we operate. This isn't who I am." The silence on his end lasted long enough that I thought he'd hung up. "Richard, I want to believe you. I've known you for 6 years, but this woman says she speaks for your firm, and if this is how Wellington treats relationships now—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Now, before I tell you how Audrey Sinclair discovered that burning bridges has consequences, do me a favor. If you're enjoying this story, if you want to see how a 29-year veteran dismantled a trust fund princess's entire career, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. It fuels the algorithm, and frankly, I'm going to need witnesses for what comes next. The destruction is spectacular. Audrey's face when she realized what she'd done, that's coming. Back to the disaster. I spent the next 2 weeks trying to salvage the Meridian deal. Phone calls, emails, a trip to Boston where Theodore wouldn't even take a meeting. His assistant was polite but firm. "Mr. Ashworth has asked me to let you know that he's reconsidering his strategic options. He'll be in touch if circumstances change." If circumstances change. 6 years of work, $2.8 billion in transaction value, $67 million in fees, reduced to if circumstances change. I documented everything, every email, every call log, every instance of Audrey overriding decisions she didn't understand, every warning she'd been given and ignored, every recommendation she'd rejected without reading. I built a file so comprehensive it could have been submitted as evidence in a malpractice case. Time-stamped, cross-referenced, organized with the precision of someone who'd spent 29 years preparing due diligence packages. Not because I was planning revenge, because I knew, with the certainty that comes from 29 years in this industry, that documentation matters. It always matters. The people who don't document are the people who lose. The termination came on a Friday.
Let me tell you about that day, because the details matter. It was November 8th, a Friday. The market had closed down slightly on trade concerns. Our stock was trading at $84.27, near its quarterly high. The Meridian deal, despite Audrey's interference, was still technically active. Most of the firm didn't know anything was wrong. I'd spent the morning in meetings about closing procedures, document checklists, regulatory submission timelines, the kind of detailed work that would make the deal successful if it actually closed. The kind of work that Audrey never attended because it was too granular for someone focused on strategic value creation. At 4:15 p.m., I got a calendar invite. Urgent discussion, conference room 35A. No agenda, no attendees listed except me, sent from Audrey's assistant. Conference room 35A was the glass fishbowl on the corner of the executive floor, the room they used for partner meetings, the room where we'd announced our largest deals, the room where Audrey had been installed as Chief Investment Officer 53 days earlier. She'd scheduled my termination for 4:30 p.m., late enough that most of the floor would be clearing out for the weekend, early enough that she could make her 7 p.m. reservation at whatever restaurant was currently impressing people who need restaurants to feel important. I knew what was coming the moment I saw the invite. 29 years in finance teaches you to read the signals. Urgent meeting with no agenda, Friday afternoon timing, a glass room where everyone could watch. She wanted witnesses. She wanted people to see the old guard being cleared out. Audrey sat at the head of the chrome table, her father's seat, technically, when he bothered to attend board meetings. She was flanked by Jennifer Walsh from HR, a nervous woman clutching a folder like a life preserver, and by David Morrison, our general counsel, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. There was a box on the table, a cardboard banker's box, the universal symbol of corporate execution. They'd even put a Wellington logo on it, branded humiliation. "Richard," Audrey said, still not looking up from her phone, "we've decided to restructure the advisory function. Your position is being eliminated." I didn't react. I just waited. Let her fill the silence. Silence makes people uncomfortable. They say things they don't mean to say. The investment banking landscape has evolved beyond traditional relationship-based origination. We need aggressive perspectives, digital native approaches. Frankly, the Meridian situation has demonstrated that our current methodology isn't aligned with market velocity. Market velocity? I'd been in this industry since before she was born, and I'd never heard anyone use the phrase market velocity who actually understood markets. The Meridian situation, that's what she was calling it? The 6-year relationship she'd destroyed in a single phone call was now the Meridian situation? Like it was a market correction, like it was something that happened to her rather than something she caused. "The partnership has approved a severance package," David said, sliding a folder across the chrome. 14 months of salary, continued health benefits, a reference letter acknowledging your contributions. "We'll need your laptop, your badge, and your access credentials by end of business today," Jennifer added. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items." I looked at the folder. I didn't open it. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" Audrey asked, finally looking up from her phone. Her eyes were curious, predatory, like a day trader watching a position collapse. I stood up slowly. My back ached from the decades of red-eye flights and conference room chairs. I walked to the window, the same window where I'd stood 100 times watching the city lights while I worked out deal structures in my head. "Just one thing," I said.
you might want to check the terms of the Meridian engagement letter, specifically the exclusivity clause. The smirk on her face flickered, first crack in the facade. What about it? The engagement isn't with Wellington, it's with me, personally. Theodore Ashworth doesn't trust institutions, he trusts people. The engagement letter names me as the exclusive advisor. If I'm terminated, the engagement terminates with me. The room went very quiet. That can't be right, Audrey said, her voice losing its practiced smoothness. That's not standard engagement structure. No, it's not standard. It's the only structure Theodore would accept. I spent 4 years convincing him that I would personally shepherd this transaction, and he agreed on the condition that the engagement followed me, not the firm. Your legal team approved it. Check the file. David was already pulling up documents on his laptop, his face going progressively paler. He's right, David said quietly. Section 12.4. The engagement and associated advisory rights are contingent on Richard Thornton's continued involvement. Termination of his role constitutes automatic termination of the engagement. Audrey's phone clattered onto the chrome. First time I'd seen her drop anything. That means Meridian walks, or more accurately, they walk towards another advisor, and given that your phone call already damaged the relationship significantly, I'd estimate you have about 48 hours before Theodore Ashworth starts returning calls from Goldman. I picked up the severance folder. I didn't sign anything. I'll have my attorney review this. In the meantime, you might want to call an emergency partnership meeting because you're about to have to explain to your father how you killed a $67 million fee and destroyed our most important client relationship in less than 2 months. I walked out. I didn't look back. The weekend passed quietly. I spent Saturday doing things I'd forgotten existed. A long walk, dinner with my wife, an evening without checking my Bloomberg terminal every 15 minutes. Sunday, I started making calls, not about the situation, just checking in with people. Old colleagues, former clients, the network of relationships I'd built over 29 years, letting them know I was available, open to conversations. By Sunday evening, word had started to spread. Richard Thornton terminated from Wellington, something about a deal falling apart, something about a new CIO who'd made some mistakes. The industry is small. People talk. By Sunday night, I'd received 23 messages of support and 4 informal inquiries about potential opportunities. I declined them all, politely. I had other plans. The first sign of trouble came Monday morning. My phone rang at 7:52 a.m., a number I didn't recognize, Boston prefix. Richard, this is Marcus Webb. I'm general counsel at Goldman Sachs Asset Management. I sat up, suddenly very awake. Theodore Ashworth called our office Friday evening. He said he's interested in discussing alternative advisory arrangements for the sovereign transaction. He mentioned you might be available to consult on the engagement. I smiled. Theodore Ashworth was a careful man. He wasn't just walking away from Wellington, he was making sure I had options. I might be available, I said. Let me check my calendar. By Wednesday, the news had leaked. The Wall Street Journal ran a story titled, "Meridian Capital Deal in Jeopardy. Sources say Wellington engagement collapsed." The article mentioned strategic disagreements and a recent leadership transition in Wellington's advisory practice. Wellington's stock dropped 6% on the news, about $340 million in market cap, evaporated overnight. Let me tell you what $340 million in market cap loss looks like inside an investment bank. The partnership went into crisis mode, emergency calls with institutional shareholders who wanted explanations, analysts downgrading their ratings, hedge funds circling because they smelled blood. The finance team started getting nervous about covenant compliance on the firm's credit facilities. When your stop drops, your borrowing capacity can be affected. Suddenly, the CFO was spending his days reassuring lenders instead of managing capital. The partners were in perpetual emergency meeting mode. I heard later that there were 5 all-hands calls in the first week alone, each one featuring increasingly desperate attempts to spin the situation as a strategic pause, rather than what it actually was, a catastrophic failure of leadership. The associates were terrified. When a major engagement falls apart, everyone starts wondering what else is going to fall apart. Morale collapsed. Key people started taking calls from recruiters. The uncertainty was toxic. And at the center of all this chaos was Audrey Sinclair, who was discovering that being a chief investment officer is significantly harder than being a chief investment officer's daughter. By Friday, Theodore Ashworth had announced that Meridian was entertaining alternative advisory arrangements for its strategic review. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Lazard, all the banks he'd previously passed over, were suddenly back at the table. He'd also announced that he was disappointed that the Wellington engagement hadn't worked out, but that he remained committed to finding the right partner for the sovereign transaction. The statement didn't mention me by name, but people who understood the situation knew exactly who he was talking about.
And then came the announcement that changed everything. He'd retained an independent consultant to advise on the advisory selection process, a consultant named Richard Thornton, former managing director of strategic advisory at Wellington Partners. The financial press went crazy. Fired banker returns as client's advisor. Wellington's loss is Goldman's gain. The $67 million man. Someone at Bloomberg dug up the exclusivity clause and ran a story about how Audrey Sinclair's termination decision had triggered the collapse. They interviewed 4 anonymous sources who described her management style as aggressive and her strategic judgment as catastrophically flawed. Audrey's first call came Saturday morning at 7 a.m. I let it go to voicemail. "Richard, it's Audrey. We need to talk. There's clearly been some miscommunication about the Meridian situation. I'm sure we can work something out. Call me back." Miscommunication? She was calling the destruction of a 6-year relationship and a $2.8 billion deal a miscommunication. Her second call came Sunday evening. Her voice was tighter. "Richard, this is getting out of hand. The partnership is asking questions. My father is asking questions. I understand you're upset about the transition, but tanking a major engagement to prove a point is incredibly unprofessional. Call me, please." Tanking a major engagement? She still didn't understand. I hadn't tanked anything. She had tanked it when she made that phone call to Theodore Ashworth. I was just the trigger that revealed the damage she'd already done. Her third call came Monday at midnight. She was clearly no longer in control. "Richard, I'm asking you directly. What do you want? Your position back? A consulting fee? Name your price. The partnership is meeting tomorrow and I need something to tell them. They're talking about clawing back my compensation. My father won't return my calls. Please, just tell me what you want." I didn't call her back. I was busy. Theodore Ashworth and I were having dinner at a restaurant in Boston, reviewing the proposals from the competing advisory firms. Goldman's proposal was comprehensive, but their fee structure was aggressive. Morgan Stanley's was cleaner, but they lacked specific sovereign experience. Lazard's was interesting, but their restructuring focus didn't fit the transaction profile. "What about Wellington?" Theodore asked, somewhere between the second and third course. I set down my fork. "What about them? Would you go back, if they asked?" I considered the question. I'd spent 29 years building something at Wellington. Relationships, institutional knowledge, a reputation that opened doors. "They'd have to ask the right way," I said finally, "and they'd have to mean it." Theodore nodded. "I'll keep the door open, but they'd need to send someone who actually understands what they're asking for." The partnership meeting happened Tuesday morning.
I wasn't there, obviously, but David Morrison called me afterward, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who just witnessed a corporate execution. It was brutal, he said. Audrey tried to blame you, said you deliberately structured the engagement to create leverage for exactly this situation. Harrison Sinclair defended her for about 20 minutes. Then the other partners started asking questions about the phone call to Theodore Ashworth. What phone call? Apparently, Audrey's "accelerate the timeline" conversation had been recorded. Theodore's compliance officer always records calls with counterparties, SEC requirement for registered investment advisors. He sent the transcript to the partnership yesterday afternoon. I hadn't known about the transcript. Theodore hadn't mentioned it. But that was Theodore, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always protecting his position. The recording was not good for Audrey, David continued. She threatened him, not explicitly but clearly enough, implied that if he didn't agree to accelerated terms, Wellington might reconsider our commitment to the engagement, suggested that our partnership was aligned on optimizing fee structures regardless of client preferences. That's not a threat, that's just aggressive negotiation. Maybe, but she also mentioned that she had partnership authority to explore alternative transaction structures if he wasn't cooperative. Theodore's lawyers interpreted that as a suggestion that Wellington might restructure the deal in ways that weren't in Meridian's best interest, which would have been a fiduciary breach if she actually done it. My eyes closed. Audrey hadn't just damaged the relationship, she'd created legal exposure. The engagement letter specifically required Wellington to act in Meridian's best interest. Even suggesting otherwise could be considered a breach. There's more, David said. The partnership asked for the email chain where she decided to make the call. Turns out she'd been explicitly warned by 4 different people not to contact Theodore directly. Catherine Park sent her a memo the day before saying that any communication should go through you. Robert O'Coffer flagged concerns about regulatory implications. Even Linda Vasquez, who she'd already decided to fire, sent an analysis outlining the relationship risks. She ignored all of them? She deleted the emails, or thought she did. IT recovered them from the backup server. The partnership saw everything. The warnings she ignored, the advice she overruled, the pattern of decision-making that led directly to this disaster. What happened?
Harrison Sinclair tried to table the discussion, said it was a personnel matter that should be handled internally, said the partnership was overreacting, said his daughter was being unfairly targeted by people who resented her disrupting the status quo. How did that go over? Margaret Chen, the chair of the ethics committee, asked him point-blank whether he'd disclosed his daughter's hiring to the compensation committee as a related party transaction. He said it wasn't relevant because she was qualified. Margaret asked him to define qualified. He couldn't give a straight answer. The other partners started looking at each other. And then William Park, the longest-serving partner, made a motion. He said that given the magnitude of the situation, the partnership needed to initiate an independent review of the entire Meridian engagement, including all communications and decisions made since Audrey took over. He said it was necessary to determine whether there were governance failures that needed to be addressed. Harrison objected. Harrison went nuclear, said it was a witch hunt, said the partnership was trying to embarrass his family, said he'd built his stake in this firm from nothing and he wasn't going to let a bunch of legacy bureaucrats destroy his daughter's reputation. That must have played well. About as well as you'd expect. The motion passed 14-3. The 3 no votes were Harrison, Audrey, and one partner who owes his seat to Harrison's initial investment. Everyone else supported the investigation. And Audrey? Administrative leave pending the review. Her access has been suspended. Security escorted her out of the building 2 hours ago.
Harrison walked out of the meeting before the final vote and hasn't been back since. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. 29 years at a firm, and it had come to this. But I wasn't done yet. 2 weeks later, the independent review was complete. The findings were devastating. Audrey had not only damaged the Meridian relationship, she'd also approved a series of consulting contracts with her former Harvard Business School classmates that totaled $3.8 million. None of them had gone through proper procurement review. Let me explain why that mattered. Wellington has strict policies for consulting engagements over $75,000. Competitive bidding required, justification documentation, partner approval. These policies exist because consulting contracts are one of the easiest ways for executives to funnel firm money to friends while calling it strategic investment. Audrey had bypassed all of it. She'd signed sole source contracts with 4 different consultants, all of whom she'd known at Harvard. The contracts were vaguely worded: strategic assessment, market positioning analysis, competitive intelligence. When the investigators asked what deliverables had been received for $3.8 million, the answer was essentially nothing. A few PowerPoint decks that repeated publicly available information, a market analysis that consisted of data anyone could have pulled from Bloomberg, a strategic roadmap that was never implemented. $3.8 million for PowerPoint decks and lunch meetings. That's what Audrey had spent firm money on. But it got worse. She'd also terminated Catherine Park, my deputy, specifically because Catherine had questioned the legitimacy of those contracts. Catherine had sent an email, professionally worded but clearly concerned, asking for clarification on the procurement process for the consulting engagements. She'd noted that the contracts didn't appear in the standard approval workflow. She'd suggested that the compliance team should review them. Audrey had fired her 3 days later. The official reason was organizational restructuring. The real reason was that Catherine had asked the right questions and Audrey didn't want anyone looking at the answers. The partnership voted unanimously to terminate Audrey Sinclair's employment. The press release called it a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities. Nobody believed it. The partnership also voted to claw back Audrey's signing bonus and unvested equity, $4.2 million in compensation that she'd received for 53 days of destruction. Harrison Sinclair resigned from the board the following day. The announcement cited personal reasons and a desire to focus on other ventures. The subtext was clear. He'd been given a choice between resigning voluntarily or being removed for cause. 3 weeks later, Theodore Ashworth called me directly. It was a Sunday evening. I was sitting on my porch, watching the sunset, thinking about 29 years of deals and relationships and late nights. The phone rang. "Richard," Theodore said, "I've made my decision about Meridian. I need to talk to you." "I'm listening." "I've reviewed all the advisory proposals. Goldman's is solid. Morgan Stanley's is clean. Lazard's is interesting, but none of them feel right." He paused. "Richard, I built this firm over 37 years. I know every major client personally. I've been to their board meetings, their annual dinners, their children's graduations. These aren't accounts to be optimized. They're relationships that trusted me." "I know, Theodore. The only person who's ever talked to me about this transaction in a way that made me believe my clients would be protected was you. Not Wellington, not Goldman, you." I didn't say anything. I just waited. "I want to sell to Sovereign. The deal structure we built is still right, but I want you advising the transaction. Not as a Wellington employee, as an independent advisor. I'll pay your fee directly. I want you back in a position where you can actually protect my clients, not just advise on protecting them." I was quiet for a long moment. "Theodore, I'm 61 years old. I was thinking about retiring in a few years, maybe teaching, maybe writing about all the deals I've seen, maybe just sitting on this porch without checking my phone every 5 minutes." "Richard, you just orchestrated the most elegant professional correction I've ever witnessed, and you did it without raising your voice or sending a single angry email. You didn't sue them, you didn't go to the press. You just let the consequences of their decisions unfold naturally. That's exactly the kind of judgment I want protecting my clients during this transition. You're flattering me. I'm being accurate. 3 years. Give me 3 years to see this through and then retire on a beach somewhere with enough money to buy the beach. I'll help you pick the beach." I thought about Audrey Sinclair's face when she realized what she'd done, the confusion that gave way to panic, the certainty that crumbled into desperation. I thought about Catherine Park, who'd been fired for asking the right questions. I thought about Robert O'Coffer and Linda Vasquez, who'd been pushed out for having the experience to see what Audrey couldn't. I thought about 29 years of work that had nearly been destroyed by 53 days of arrogance. "I'll need certain conditions," I said.
Name them. Catherine Park gets a job offer from Sovereign as part of the integration team, full compensation for the time she was unemployed, a senior role with meaningful authority. Done. Robert O'Coffer gets the same offer, compliance leadership. Done. Linda Vasquez gets the same offer, integration management. Done. And I want a written commitment in the transaction documents that any future changes to Meridian's client service model require approval from a client advisory board, not just management discretion, actual client input. You want to prevent another Audrey. I want to protect the institution from people who don't understand that client relationships take decades to build and moments to destroy. I want to make sure that the next time someone's father buys their way in, there's a structure that can say no. Theodore laughed. "Richard, if you'd asked for those terms 6 months ago, I might have hesitated. Now, after watching you work, you could have asked for twice as much, and I'd have agreed. I learned from the best." "Who was that?" "A man named Theodore Ashworth who turned down $3.1 billion because he cared more about his clients than his payout." There was a long silence on the phone. "Richard," he said finally, "I think we're going to do something important together." The deal closed 10 weeks later. $2.95 billion, $150 million more than the original terms, because the competitive process had increased Sovereign's conviction. Wellington stock eventually recovered, but not before several partners had quietly reduced their positions at significant losses. The transaction generated $71 million in total advisory fees, split between my independent practice and the various firms that contributed expertise. Not the $67 million that Wellington would have earned. More, because when you do things right, the value compounds. The integration went smoothly. Not perfectly, because integrations never are. There were late nights, difficult conversations, moments where it seemed like the cultural differences might be too wide to bridge, but smoothly. Theodore's clients stayed. Every single one of the 340 institutional relationships. Not a single pension fund, not a single endowment, not a single foundation. They all stayed because they trusted the process. The service model he'd built was preserved. The 5-year fee lock was honored. The client advisory board I'd insisted on actually worked, actually had input, actually protected the things that mattered. 18 months later, Meridian's assets under management had grown from $127 billion to $156 billion, a 23% increase, not from acquisition, from trust, from existing clients adding assets because they believed in what Sovereign was building. The deal that everyone said was dead turned out to be one of the most successful asset management transactions in recent history. Case studies at Harvard Business School, features in industry publications, a model for how acquisitions should be done. I stood in Theodore's office on the day of the final closing, watching Boston through the window that's seen 37 years of his career. The tombstones from completed deals lined his walls, the photos of client events, the awards and recognitions.
37 years of building something that mattered. Catherine Park was there, running integration with the precision that had made her legendary. Every detail tracked, every timeline honored, every client touchpoint handled with care. Robert O'Coffer was there, ensuring every regulatory requirement was satisfied. SEC filings, FINRA notifications, international compliance, the invisible work that keeps transactions legal. Linda Vasquez was there, managing the transition with the same skill she'd used to save dozens of companies from bankruptcy. Calm under pressure, clear in communication, trusted by everyone in the room. Theodore caught my eye from across the room. He raised his coffee cup in a small salute. "Thank you," he said quietly, "not for the deal, for making sure it was the right deal, for making sure the people who trusted me weren't betrayed. Thank you for trusting me," I said, "for all of it, for 6 years of patience, for believing that the right way was worth waiting for." He smiled. "The right way is always worth waiting for, Richard. That's something our industry has forgotten. Maybe deals like this one can help them remember." That night, I drove past Harrison Sinclair's house in Greenwich, not to gloat, just to see. The lights were on. Through the window, I could see him sitting alone in what looked like a study. He was staring at something on his desk. Maybe the board resignation he'd signed, maybe a letter from his daughter, maybe just the remnants of a reputation he'd spent decades building, now tarnished by 53 days of his daughter's arrogance. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. There was no satisfaction in his suffering, only the quiet recognition that consequences exist, even for people who've spent their lives avoiding them. Audrey Sinclair took a job at a fintech startup 8 months later, something in digital wealth management. The company raised $40 million, burned through it in 14 months, and quietly shut down. Apparently, disruption is easier to talk about than to actually do. Last I heard, she was back at her father's fund in a junior role, working on deals that would never make headlines. Her LinkedIn still says she was Chief Investment Officer at Wellington Partners. It doesn't mention how long she held the position or how it ended. Some stories are told by what they leave out. Her father started a new fund 6 months after resigning from Wellington's board. He specifically focused on companies where he wouldn't have to interact with existing management teams. Smart, probably. He'd learned what happens when you install family members in positions they haven't earned. I kept working, not because I needed the money, but because the work matters. Investment banking isn't glamorous, not the real work, not the kind that actually creates value. The glamour is at the closing dinners, the tombstone announcements, the league table rankings, the bonuses that make headlines. The work is in the model at 3 a.m., the conference room where you rebuild a company's capital structure from scratch, the client call where you deliver news that will change their lives, the flight to nowhere that gets you to a meeting that might not matter, but probably will. It's the restructuring that saves 14,000 jobs and nobody writes about. The merger that creates a platform for growth that takes years to materialize. The divestiture that lets a company focus on what it does best instead of what it acquired by accident. Real banking isn't about transactions, it's about outcomes. And outcomes take time. They take patience. They take relationships. Every morning I walk through the deal files before anyone else arrives. The tombstones from 30 years of transactions. The relationships that outlasted market cycles. The clients who became friends, who became family. This is what 29 years looks like. This is what relationships look like. This is what matters. Theodore Ashworth sends me a Christmas card every year now. Last year's said, "Thank you for teaching me that integrity is the only asset that appreciates over time." He was right. He was always right. The deal pipeline hums quietly in the background. New engagements, new relationships, new transactions that will take years to mature. Nobody outside this building knows my name. Nobody in the closing dinners thanks me by name. Nobody in the press releases mentions who actually structured the deal. The journalists write about the CEOs who shake hands and the boards who approve valuations. That's okay. That's how it should be. We're not here for credit. We're here for clients. and clients keep getting served deal by deal, relationship by relationship, year by year. Because a fossil who didn't understand modern finance turned out to understand the only finance that matters. Trust takes years to build and seconds to destroy. I build, other people destroy. And when the destroyers come for what I've built, I make sure they understand the cost. That's how a 29-year veteran outlasted a hedge fund princess with a Harvard MBA and an 18% stake. The merger and the acquisition. Except in this version, the acquisition was trust, and the merger was between patience and consequences. Thanks for sticking around. If you enjoyed watching an investment bank, remember that client relationships matter more than fee optimization. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and share it with anyone who's ever been called a fossil by someone who couldn't close a deal if their bonus depended on it. If you've ever built something over years that someone tried to destroy in days, this one's for you. Keep building. The destroyers always run out of things to destroy eventually. Until next time, remember the people who build relationships are the people who build legacies. Everyone else is just rearranging deck chairs on ships they didn't build and don't know how to sail. Stay patient out there. The patience always wins in the end. And the next time someone calls you a fossil, just remember fossils are evidence that something endured. The people calling you obsolete won't last 53 days. Ask Audrey Sinclair. She found out the hard way. Some lessons can only be taught by consequences, and consequences, unlike trust fund distributions, can't be negotiated away. That's a wrap on this one. See you in the next story. And remember, in finance, the only asset that never depreciates is the trust people place in you. Protect it, because once it's gone, no amount of money can buy it back. Audrey Sinclair learned that lesson. Maybe you won't have to. But if someone ever comes into your world and tries